boring history for bedtime, medieval charity, sickness, and death. Tonight, we delve into a darker period, the Middle Ages. Beyond Hollywood's romanticized castles and chivalry lies a time of rampant disease, brutal punishments, and the constant specter of death, softened only by acts of charity. You'd be lucky to survive a day. So, perhaps turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's embark on this journey together. The economics of misery, medieval charity, and its contradictions. Let us start with a fundamental truth about medieval life. Even on the most well-managed estates, the number of poor, disabled, and generally miserable people was staggering. Picture this, if you will. Imagine walking through the countryside of 13th century France, and everywhere you look, some people cannot make ends meet. Not just a few unfortunate souls here and there, but crowds of them. Entire families reduced to begging. Children born into poverty have no realistic hope of climbing out of it. Adults who started life with promise, but were broken by injury, disease, or simple economic catastrophe. Now, you might assume that in such a harsh, hierarchical society, the wealthy would ignore these masses of suffering humanity. After all, medieval nobles weren't exactly known for their progressive social policies. But here's where things get interesting. In that, particularly medieval way, the upper classes gave quite generously to the poor. Not out of any modern sense of social justice, mind you, but for reasons that were simultaneously more selfish and more complex. Take our Baroness Adela, for instance. She's a noblewoman at the fictional castle of Saint Aliquis, and she represents the typical approach to charity in her era. When she ventures out to distribute alms, she's not doing it because she's conducted a careful study of poverty reduction strategies. She's doing it because her immortal soul depends on it. In medieval Christian theology, giving to the poor was a form of spiritual transaction. You gave away a portion of your earthly wealth, and in return, you purchased a reduction in your time, in purgatory. It was a matter of religious accounting, pure and simple. The haughtiest cavalier, as our source puts it, felt it was his duty to scatter copper coins among the poor, though he might tell his squire to satisfy this hungry rabble with obvious contempt. But notice the contradiction here. Contempt for the recipients paired with genuine belief in the necessity of the act. The poor were simultaneously despised and essential. Without them, how could the rich buy their way into heaven? This created a perverse economic incentive that medieval people were dimly aware of, but never quite willing to address directly. As our chronicle notes with dark humor, it would be calamitous if there were suddenly to be no poor, worthy, or unworthy. For how then, by parting with some of their abundance, could the rich buy peace for their souls? The poor weren't just an unfortunate byproduct of medieval society. They were a necessary component of the spiritual economy. Every morning at castles and monasteries across Europe, you could witness this strange ritual. The gates would open, and crowds of beggars would gather for the daily dole. Not just a few loaves of bread, but substantial amounts of food. The quantities given away were genuinely impressive by any standard. However, what made it particularly medieval in its approach was the virtually non-existent attempt to address the root causes of poverty. No job training programs for people with disabilities, no systematic support for widows, no institutions for caring for the mentally impaired. Instead, every incentive was placed on maintaining the status quo of dependence. This system actively encouraged fraud and professional begging. Our chronicler describes the scene at St. Aliquis with sardonic detail. There's the man on crutches who can run quite fast when he needs to escape the law. The fellow, covered in sores, claimed to be on pilgrimage, but was a faker. The woman who throws herself down foaming at the mouth, pretending to have epilepsy with the help of a bit of soap, a trick she'd tried the day before in the village. Brother Gensenius, the castle's almoner, had become an expert at spotting these performances. But here's the truly medieval part. It didn't matter whether the beggars were deserving or not. The spiritual benefit to the giver remained the same, regardless of the worthiness of the recipient. You could argue that giving to undeserving beggars was almost more spiritually valuable, since it demonstrated greater selflessness and faith. The morning dole became a theatrical performance repeated daily across feudal Europe. The nobles felt virtuous and secure in their salvation. The genuinely poor got just enough food to survive another day. The professional beggars made a living from their performances, and the underlying systems that created poverty in the first place remained completely untouched. It was charity, as social control, dressed up in the language of Christian virtue. What made this system particularly cruel was how it normalized suffering. When poverty is viewed as a divinely ordained opportunity for the wealthy to practice virtue, then poverty becomes not a problem to be solved, but a permanent feature of the social landscape. The poor were expected to bear their lot with Christian resignation, accumulating spiritual credit that would supposedly reduce their time in purgatory. Suffering in this life was simply preparation for reward in the next. This wasn't just callousness disguised as piety. It was a sophisticated ideological system that made inequality feel inevitable and even beneficial. The rich needed the poor to practice charity. The poor needed suffering to purify their souls. Everyone had their role to play in God's great plan, and questioning that plan was not just impractical, but potentially heretical. The scale of this daily ritual was staggering when considered across all of medieval Europe. Every castle, every monastery, every major household with pretensions to nobility was engaging in this same performance every single day. Thousands of pounds of bread, countless gallons of ale, enormous quantities of leftover meat, all distributed not based on need or efficiency, but according to spiritual accounting principles that had been refined over centuries. The brutal mathematics of medieval mortality. Having explored that unpleasant reality of charitable systems, we move to another aspect of medieval life that modern people struggle to comprehend: just how quickly and thoroughly the human body was worn down by the conditions of the time. The medieval period was not kind to human longevity, and this wasn't simply a matter of lacking modern medicine. The very structure of medieval life was designed to break people down at an accelerated pace. Consider this sobering fact. Henry II of England, one of the most powerful men in Europe, was considered old at 47. Philip Augustus was conducting the serious business of ruling France at the age of 15. Many barons were gray-haired and decrepit by 40, and by 50, their sons were often plotting to replace them, viewing their fathers as superannuated and past their prime. If this was the reality for the wealthy and powerful, with access to the best food, the most comfortable living conditions, and the finest medical care available, imagine what life was like for everyone else. The peasant families we encounter, such as Georges and Jeanne, were described as aged before their time, and this was no poetic exaggeration. It was a simple statement of biological fact. Medieval life aged people with ruthless efficiency through a combination of grinding labor, poor nutrition, constant exposure to disease, and living conditions that would be considered uninhabitable by any modern standard. The The grinding toil that defined most people's lives didn't just make them tired, it systematically weakened their bodies, leaving them vulnerable to diseases that a healthier person might have been able to fight off. When you're spending 14 hours a day, engaged in backbreaking agricultural labor, often on insufficient nutrition, your immune system doesn't have the resources to mount effective defenses against infection. But the physical demands of labor were just one component of a larger system of bodily destruction. Medieval people lived in conditions that were almost perfectly designed to promote the transmission of disease and chronic health problems. The peasants, as our source notes with typical medieval bluntness, almost lived on the manure heap. This wasn't metaphorical. Their living quarters were often directly adjacent to animal waste, human waste, and decomposing organic matter. The clothing situation alone was enough to guarantee chronic skin problems. Nearly everything worn close to the body was made of wool, which retains dirt and filth, is extremely difficult to wash effectively with medieval soap and water, and constantly irritates the skin. This led to widespread dermal diseases, scrofula, various forms of persistent itching, and conditions that were probably much worse, but which the chroniclers preferred not to describe in detail. Then there was the food situation, which created a cascade of health problems. Keeping meat fresh without refrigeration was nearly impossible, except through heavy salting. The vast quantities of salt-preserved meat consumed throughout medieval Europe were direct promoters of scurvy and gangrene. People knew that heavily salted food wasn't ideal, but they also knew that rotten meat would kill you faster than the gradual effects of a salt-heavy diet. Personal hygiene was not just poor by modern standards, it was actively discouraged by religious authorities. The clergy, while not necessarily unclean themselves, rarely preached the virtues of bathing. Their frequent sermons about despising the body and focusing entirely on spiritual matters discouraged people from paying attention to physical cleanliness. Taking too much care of your physical appearance could be seen as vanity, which is often considered a sin. Better to be dirty and holy than clean, and potentially vain. This created a perfect storm of conditions for disease to flourish. Poor sanitation, inadequate nutrition, constant physical stress, contaminated water sources, overcrowded living conditions, minimal personal hygiene, and clothing that trapped dirt and irritated the skin. When you combine all these factors, it's surprising that anyone survived to what we would consider old age. The mathematics of medieval mortality becomes even more stark when you consider childbirth and early childhood. A mother was considered fortunate if she didn't lose between 1/3 and 1/2 of all her children during birth or in the immediate aftermath. Every pregnancy was a gamble with death, even when the midwife was skilled and experienced. The process of birth itself was so traumatic under medieval conditions that children who survived were often physically imperfect or dangerously weakened for life. This was true even among royal families who had access to the best medical care available at the time. If queens and princesses were losing half their children to the dangers of medieval childbirth, imagine the mortality rates among peasant families living in single-room huts with dirt floors and no access to professional medical assistance of any kind. Our chronicler makes the grimly practical observation that this brutal selection process meant that the average person who survived to adulthood was unusually tough and resilient. Only the strongest individuals were able to survive the ordeals of birth and childhood, which meant that medieval adults could give and sustain hard blows in ways that might surprise modern people. It was evolutionary pressure applied with medieval efficiency. But this resilience came at an enormous cost in human suffering and lost potential. How many potential scholars, artists, inventors, or leaders died before their 5th birthday because they contracted dysentery from contaminated water. How many capable adults were reduced to begging because a workplace injury that modern medicine could easily treat left them permanently disabled? The waste of human potential was staggering, but it was so normalized that medieval people rarely even thought to comment on it. The Catalogue of Medieval Diseases, a comprehensive survey of suffering. Let us now turn to the specific diseases that plagued medieval populations, because understanding the medical realities of the time helps explain why so many aspects of medieval society developed as they did. When disease and death are constant companions, when pain is an everyday reality for most people, it changes how entire civilizations think about everything from religion to economics to social relationships. Leprosy was perhaps the most feared disease of the medieval period, and with good reason. Not because it was always fatal, it often wasn't, but because of the social death it imposed on its victims. The disease was poorly understood, which meant that many cases of severe but curable skin conditions like eczema were incorrectly diagnosed as leprosy. Once someone was declared leprous, they were condemned to what our source calls a life death, permanent banishment to filthy cabins in the woods, cut off from all human contact except with other lepers. The social protocols around leprosy were elaborately cruel. Lepers were required to carry wooden clappers or bones to signal their approach from a distance, warning healthy people to keep their distance. They couldn't enter towns, couldn't touch anything that others might later touch, couldn't even speak to healthy people except from a considerable distance. In many places, lepers were required to undergo a form of funeral service while still alive, symbolically dying to the community before being sent away to live as outcasts. But leprosy, terrible as it was, wasn't even the most dangerous disease facing medieval populations. Cholera and smallpox would periodically sweep through regions like wildfire, and they were almost always fatal once contracted. The mortality rates during epidemic outbreaks could be staggering. Entire villages might lose half their population in a matter of weeks. What made these diseases particularly terrifying was the complete helplessness people felt in their presence. The prevailing medical understanding of the time held that diseases like cholera and smallpox were transmitted in the air, which meant that ordinary isolation was considered ineffective. If the disease was spread by bad air, then simply staying away from sick people wouldn't protect you. The only response was to pray to the appropriate saints and hope for divine intervention. This led to a kind of fatalistic resignation that pervaded medieval attitudes toward disease. If God wanted to send cholera to devastate an entire duchy, then cholera would devastate the duchy as a whole, regardless of any human precautions. The idea that clean water, proper sanitation, and systematic isolation might be effective against the disease was occasionally suggested. Still, it contradicted both religious teachings about divine will and practical observations about how diseases seem to spread. The ravages of these epidemic diseases were so severe that they affected villages more than castles, although not necessarily because castle dwellers had better access to medical treatment. The slightly better nutrition and somewhat cleaner living conditions in castles provided marginal protection. Still, even wealthy noble families could be completely wiped out by a single outbreak of smallpox or cholera. Beyond these dramatic epidemic diseases, medieval populations suffered from a host of other conditions that were fearfully common. Nervous complaints, as our source delicately puts it, made up small armies of sufferers. The general atmosphere of terror and uncertainty that defined medieval life, constant warfare, brooding fears of demonic possession, terrifying religious imagery about eternal damnation, and the sheer boredom and isolation of life in many castles and convents drove significant numbers of people completely out of their minds. Mental illness was particularly poorly understood and cruelly treated. People suffering from what we might recognize as depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress were often believed to be possessed by devils. They were frequently locked in dungeons or subjected to violent exorcism rituals. The lucky ones might be treated with kindness, but most were removed from society and forgotten. Religious beliefs about demonic possession and divine punishment further complicated the medieval understanding of mental illness. If someone was behaving strangely, it might be because God was punishing them for their sins, or because demons had possessed them, or because they were holy and experiencing divine visions. Distinguishing between mental illness, spiritual experience, and demonic possession was a matter of theological interpretation rather than medical diagnosis. Gastrointestinal diseases were endemic, partly due to poor food preservation and partly due to contaminated water sources. Dysentery could kill you quickly, but chronic digestive problems could slowly weaken you over the years, making you vulnerable to other diseases. Scurvy was common, especially during winter months when fresh food was unavailable. Rickets affected many children, leading to permanent bone deformities that marked them as members of the lower classes for life. Respiratory diseases flourished in the cramped, poorly ventilated living conditions that most people endured. Tuberculosis was widespread, though not consistently recognized as a distinct disease. Pneumonia was often fatal, especially among the elderly and children. The constant exposure to smoke from cooking fires and heating meant that most people suffered from chronic cough and lung irritation. Dental problems were universal and agonizing. Without sugar, medieval people didn't suffer from tooth decay at the same rates as modern populations, but they did suffer from worn teeth, infected gums, and painful abscesses. Tooth extraction was performed without anesthesia by whoever happened to be handy, often the local blacksmith or executioner. Eye diseases were common, partly due to poor nutrition and partly due to smoke exposure. Cataracts often led to complete blindness, and even minor eye infections could result in permanent vision loss without proper treatment. In a world where most people's livelihoods depended on manual labor, even partial vision loss could be economically devastating. Skin diseases affect almost everyone to some degree. The combination of poor hygiene, wool clothing, contaminated water, and inadequate nutrition created ideal conditions for various forms of dermatitis, boils, and chronic infections. What our source refers to as scrofula, the itch, and things even worse, probably included conditions that were both painful and disfiguring, marking sufferers as undesirable for marriage or employment. The peculiar arts of medieval medicine, healing through faith and foolishness. Having explored the catalog of diseases that tormented medieval populations, we must now examine the various attempts to combat these afflictions. Medieval medicine was a fascinating mixture of genuine herbal knowledge, religious faith, complete superstition, and occasional flashes of practical wisdom. Understanding how people tried to heal themselves reveals a great deal about medieval psychology and the relationship between faith and reason in daily life. The first line of defense against illness was almost always spiritual, rather than medical. Good Christians firmly believed that invoking the appropriate healing saints was more effective than consulting physicians or wise women. This wasn't simply ignorance. It was a coherent theological system based on the belief that disease was fundamentally a spiritual problem requiring spiritual solutions. The specialization of saints for particular ailments had reached remarkable levels of detail by the medieval period. If you suffered from indigestion, you would invoke the patron saint of travelers, Saint Christopher. Dropsy required the intervention of Saint Eutropius. Fever called for prayers to Saint Petronilla. For plague, you appealed to Saint Roch. Insanity required Saint Mathurin. Kidney complaints were the domain of Saint René. Cramps were associated with Saint Crampin, whose name suggests either a delightful sense of humor on the part of medieval Christians or a remarkable coincidence of nomenclature. This system of specialized saintly intervention wasn't just comforting, it was practical in its way. It gave people a sense of agency when confronting diseases they couldn't understand or control. Instead of feeling utterly helpless in the face of a mysterious illness, you could take specific action by praying to the appropriate saint, making offerings, or organizing processions. The psychological comfort of believing you were doing something practical should not be underestimated. But medieval people weren't content to rely solely on divine intervention. They also employed a rich variety of folk remedies that ranged from occasionally effective to downright ridiculous. Some of these treatments were based on genuine observation of what seemed to work. Others were based on elaborate theories about the nature of disease and the human body that bore no relationship to reality. The belief that an ass's breath could drive poison from the body suggests a theory of disease based on the idea that corrupted air could be countered by pure animal essence. Touching a dead man's tooth to cure a toothache was probably based on sympathetic magic, the idea that like cures like, or that the nature of death could somehow drive away the death-like pain of an infected tooth. For nosebleeds, the recommended treatment was to pinch the nose with 2 straws shaped like a cross. This combined practical pressure on the blood vessels with the spiritual power of the cross symbol is a perfect example of medieval synthesis between empirical observation and religious belief. The cross-shaped straws likely helped stop nosebleeds through simple pressure and positioning, but the religious symbolism made people feel more confident about the treatment's effectiveness. The remedy for itching involved rolling yourself naked in a field of oats, which might have provided some actual relief through gentle abrasion and the absorption of oils and moisture by the grain. However, it also had clear symbolic connections to purification rituals and the idea that natural materials could cleanse both spiritual and physical contamination. Georges the peasant, our source tells us, swore that such remedies seldom failed. This confidence wasn't necessarily based on careful observation of success rates. It was based on a worldview in which the boundary between physical and spiritual healing was essentially meaningless. If you recovered after rolling in oats, then obviously the oats had cured you. If you didn't recover, then obviously your spiritual condition required more serious intervention. One of the most colorful characters in the medieval medical landscape was the local executioner who moonlighted as a healer. The logic here was beautifully medieval in its directness. Since executioners were experts at damaging and mutilating human bodies, they ought to understand the reverse process of repairing them. Maître Denis, the executioner at Saint-Aliquis, had built a reputation as a bone setter and also sold a popular panacea made from the fat of a man just hanged. The idea that human fat from an executed criminal could cure various ailments reveals several interesting aspects of medieval thinking. First, there was the belief that violent death somehow concentrated vital essences in the body, making them more potent for healing purposes. Second, there was the notion that suffering and death could be transformed into instruments of healing, a kind of alchemical conversion of evil into good. Third, there was probably some practical observation that animal fats could be effective for treating certain skin conditions and wounds. The Church's attitude toward medicine was complicated and often contradictory. On the one hand, healing the sick was a Christian duty, as commanded by Christ himself. On the other hand, too much focus on bodily healing could distract from the more critical business of spiritual salvation. St. Ambrose had declared that proper healing came through prayers and vigils, not through medical intervention. This theological ambivalence led to practical restrictions on medical education and practice. Only clerics of the inferior orders were allowed to study medical science, and the dissection of dead bodies was strongly discouraged. This meant that even highly educated physicians had a severely limited understanding of human anatomy and physiology. The result was that peasant remedies were often just as effective as professional medical treatment, which is to say, occasionally helpful, but mostly useless. The restriction on dissection had particularly far-reaching consequences. Without the ability to examine dead bodies systematically, medieval physicians were unable to develop accurate knowledge of how organs functioned or what went wrong during disease. They were forced to rely on ancient texts, theoretical speculation, and external observation of symptoms. Even distinguished scholars like Albert the Great were said to confuse tendons and nerves because they had never been able to examine them directly. At the castle level, the ordinary functionary for dealing with bodily ailments was the baron's barber, Maître Louis. When he wasn't scraping chins, he was giving the castle folk their monthly bleedings, which were considered essential for maintaining health. These bloodletting sessions took place in the great hall near the fire and were undergone regularly by both men and women. The theory behind bloodletting was based on the ancient idea that the body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness resulted from imbalances among these humors. By removing excess blood, you could supposedly restore the proper balance and thereby cure disease. In practice, bloodletting likely weakened patients and made them more vulnerable to infection. However, it was so central to medieval medical theory that questioning it was almost unthinkable. When the baron's forces went to war, Maître Louis accompanied them as barber surgeon, and he had considerable skill in setting fractures, cauterizing wounds, and applying salves. His knowledge of powerful drugs, mostly purgatives, probably helped patients with strong constitutions recover from certain conditions. Warfare provided excellent opportunities for developing practical surgical skills, since there was no shortage of traumatic injuries requiring immediate treatment. The contrast between the barber surgeon's practical battlefield medicine and his theoretical approach to chronic diseases reveals a fundamental aspect of medieval medical thought. When dealing with obvious trauma, broken bones, deep cuts, battlefield wounds, medieval practitioners could be surprisingly effective. But when dealing with diseases whose causes weren't immediately apparent, they retreated into elaborate theoretical systems that had little connection to reality. Professional medicine, the learned art of expensive incompetence. When a member of the baron's immediate family became seriously ill, the usual practice was to send to the nearest town for a professional physician. These learned doctors represented the pinnacle of medieval medical education, having supposedly studied at the great medical schools of Salerno, Montpellier, or even Cordoba. They were expensive, well-dressed, and utterly convinced of their expertise. They were also, more often than not, completely useless. Maître Payen, the physician summoned when Baron Conon fell into a fever, embodied all the contradictions of medieval professional medicine. He dressed elegantly, half like a priest and half like a wealthy merchant, wearing expensive furs that announced his prosperity and importance. He spoke learnedly of febrifuges and humors, constantly citing authorities like Avicenna and Albucasis to demonstrate his scholarly credentials. This reliance on ancient authorities was central to medieval medical education. Rather than basing their practice on systematic observation and experimentation, physicians were trained to memorize and interpret classical texts. Avicenna, the great Persian physician, and Albucasis, his follower, were treated as infallible sources, whose teachings could not be questioned. If your symptoms didn't match what Avicenna had written about similar cases, then clearly there was something wrong with your symptoms, not with Avicenna's theories. When Maître Payen encountered Baron Conon's illness, he faced the classic medieval medical dilemma. The Baron's condition didn't fit neatly into any of the standard diagnostic categories he had memorized from his texts. A competent physician might have admitted uncertainty and relied on careful observation and simple remedies. But Maître Payen was a professional, and professionals couldn't afford to appear ignorant. Instead, he fussed about, clearly betraying his bewilderment, then struck what our source calls a professional attitude, and announced oracularly that the obstruction to health is in the liver. When the Baron protested that he felt wretched in his head, not his liver, Maître Payen responded with crushing professional authority. That is foolish. Beware of that word obstruction, because you do not understand what it signifies. This exchange perfectly illustrates the arrogance and incompetence that characterized much of medieval professional medicine. Rather than listening to the patient's description of his symptoms, the physician dismissed them as irrelevant. The patient's subjective experience of his own body was considered less reliable than the physician's theoretical knowledge derived from ancient texts. Medieval medical treatises advised physicians to use this kind of intimidating rhetoric when they couldn't make a proper diagnosis but needed to maintain their authority. If you don't know what's wrong with the patient, the manuals suggest confusing them with technical terminology and making them feel stupid for questioning your expertise. It was professional incompetence disguised as scholarly authority. After establishing his dominance over the confused patient, Maître Payen proceeded to explain the theoretical basis for his diagnosis. The liver was affected, he announced, and the Baron should be glad about this, because the liver was the seat of honor, meaning that recovery would enhance the Baron's honor. The spleen, he continued, was the seat of laughter, while the lungs fanned the heart. This anatomical psychology had no basis in observation or fact, but it sounded impressive and mysterious. Having explained the theoretical underpinnings of the illness, Maître Payen proceeded to discuss treatment options. He suggested that the urine of a dog or the blood of a goat might be effective, but these were mere peasant remedies, unsuitable for a great noble. Baron Conon required medicines appropriate to his social rank. Therefore, since the liver was affected, he would be given the dried and pulverized liver of a toad. The idea that medicine should be tailored to social class rather than medical need reveals another fascinating aspect of medieval thinking. Just as clothing, food, and housing were supposed to reflect social hierarchy, so too were medical treatments. A peasant might be cured with dog urine, but a baron required more exotic and expensive remedies. The effectiveness of the treatment was less critical than its appropriateness to the patient's social status. Toad liver was presumably chosen for its rarity and expense, rather than its therapeutic properties. In the medieval understanding of sympathetic medicine, liver problems might logically be treated with liver-based remedies, and the more exotic the source, the more powerful the cure. A toad's liver would concentrate all the mysterious virtues associated with these strange amphibians, their ability to live both on land and in water, their connection to witchcraft and transformation, their generally uncanny nature. After prescribing his expensive and useless remedy, Maître Payen collected his gold piece and departed, leaving behind a patient who promptly became delirious. Fortunately for Baron Conon, his wife Adela had the practical nursing skills that every castle mistress acquired through necessity. She applied cold cloths to his body, while Father Grégoire prayed to the saints. Whether due to the clothes, the prayers, or the toad's liver, or simply because the fever had run its natural course, the Baron recovered by morning. Once he was well again, Baron Conon cursed terribly at any mention of Maître Payen, and readily agreed with the monk Guy of Provence, who wrote, "They kill numbers of the sick, and exhaust themselves to find maladies for everybody. Woe to him who falls into their power. I prefer a capon to all their mixtures." The monk did concede that certain physicians could be helpful, but more because of the confidence they inspired in patients than because of any actual effectiveness of their medicines. This assessment was probably quite accurate. Professional physicians were expensive, arrogant, and often harmful, but they did provide psychological comfort to wealthy patients who felt that they deserved the best available treatment. The elaborate rituals of diagnosis, the impressive technical vocabulary, the expensive exotic remedies, all of these things helped patients feel that they were receiving appropriate care, even when the actual medical benefit was minimal or negative. The contrast between professional medicine and folk healing reveals critical tensions in medieval society. Peasant remedies were often just as effective as learned medicine, and sometimes more so, but they lacked the social prestige that wealthy patients demanded. A baron might secretly know that his grandmother's herbal tea worked better than toad liver, but he couldn't afford to be seen relying on peasant medicine. Social status required expensive, learned remedies, regardless of their actual effectiveness. Professional physicians also served essential social functions beyond their medical role. They were learned men who could read Latin, interpret ancient texts, and engage in scholarly discussion. In a world where literacy was scarce and learning was highly valued, physicians often provided intellectual companionship to wealthy patrons. They were walking libraries of classical knowledge, living connections to the wisdom of antiquity. But this scholarly orientation came at a steep price in terms of practical effectiveness. By focusing on ancient authorities rather than direct observation, emphasizing theoretical systems over empirical results, and catering to social expectations rather than medical needs, professional medicine often did more harm than good. The very features that made physicians socially prestigious, their learning, their expensive training, their connections to classical tradition, made them less effective healers than practical nurses, folk healers, and experienced barber surgeons. Alternative healing, saints, stars, and sacred remedies. Having experienced the dubious benefits of professional medicine, Baron Conon vowed that next time he fell ill, he would place his trust in simpler remedies. He might rely on Maître Louis the barber, or even Maître Denis the executioner, or perhaps hire an astrologer to discover a remedy by consulting the stars. Alternatively, Father Gregoire might organize a healing procession, gathering all the monks, clerics, and pious laymen in the neighborhood to carry the local collection of saints' relics to the sick lord and lay them devoutly upon his abdomen. This range of healing options illustrates the medieval willingness to try multiple approaches simultaneously. Rather than choosing between medical and spiritual remedies, medieval people typically employed whatever resources were available, combining practical treatments with religious rituals and magical practices. The boundaries between medicine, religion, and magic were fluid and permeable. Astrology held a significant place in medieval healing because it provided a systematic method for timing treatments and understanding the cosmic forces that affect human health. Medieval astrologers had developed elaborate charts that showed which planets governed specific parts of the body, which times of day were favorable for different treatments, and which combinations of celestial influences might cause or cure various diseases. An astrological consultation could provide both diagnosis and treatment recommendations. If Mars were in an unfavorable position relative to the patient's birth chart, this might explain why he was suffering from fever and inflammation. The astrologer could then recommend the optimal time for bloodletting, suggest herbs associated with beneficent planets, or advise waiting until the stars were more favorable before attempting any treatment. From a modern perspective, astrological medicine seems like pure superstition, but it served several essential functions in medieval society. First, it provided a systematic framework for understanding illness that was more sophisticated and consistent than most available alternatives. Second, it gave both physicians and patients a sense of control over mysterious diseases by connecting them to cosmic patterns. Third, it offered a non-threatening explanation for illness that didn't require anyone to admit ignorance or incompetence. The healing procession represented a distinct approach, a collective spiritual intervention designed to mobilize divine power on behalf of the patient. When Father Gregoire organized such a procession for Baron Conan, he would gather every available religious person in the area and march them solemnly to the castle, carrying the entire local collection of saints' relics. These relics were the most precious possessions of medieval churches and monasteries: a fragment of bone from a martyred saint, a piece of cloth that had touched a holy shrine, a vial of oil from a sacred lamp. These objects were believed to contain concentrated spiritual power that could heal the sick, protect against evil, and work various miracles. The more critical the saint, and the more authenticated the relic, the greater its healing power. The ritual of laying relics upon the patient's body was designed to transfer this concentrated holiness directly to the afflicted area. If the Baron suffered from stomach problems, the relics would be placed on his abdomen. If he had a fever, they might be arranged around his head. The physical contact between the holy objects and the diseased body was thought to create a channel through which divine healing power could flow. This remedy had been tried in Paris for Prince Louis, the king's heir, and he had recovered promptly. Whether the recovery was due to the relics, to other treatments administered simultaneously, or simply to the natural course of the disease was impossible to determine, but the apparent success of the therapy enhanced the reputation of relic-based healing throughout the kingdom. The social dynamics of healing processions were as important as their spiritual functions. When the local clergy organized a procession for a prominent patient like Baron Conan, they were demonstrating the community's concern for his welfare and their recognition of his social standing. The more elaborate the procession, The more relics involved, the more people participating, the greater the honor shown to the patient. These processions also served to strengthen social bonds and religious solidarity. When faced with the mysterious power of disease, the entire community came together in a coordinated effort to invoke divine assistance. The procession became a public demonstration of shared faith, collective concern, and hierarchical order. Everyone had their role to play. The clergy carried the relics, the nobles provided the occasion, and the ordinary people supplied the numbers that made the procession impressive. But even the most elaborate healing processions couldn't guarantee success. Not always would the saints' relics prove effective against serious illness. When the time came for the good Lady Odalina, Baron Conan's mother, no amount of spiritual intervention could postpone the inevitable. The family postponed the administration of extreme unction until the final moment, because once that ceremony was performed, the sick person had no right to recover. The sacrament was designed to prepare the soul for death, and attempting to return to life afterward would be theologically problematic. Medieval Christians believed that extreme unction had both physical and spiritual effects on the recipient. After receiving the sacrament, hair would fall out, and natural heat would diminish, marking the beginning of the soul's separation from the body. These changes were considered normal and proper, signs that the dying person was successfully transitioning from a physical to a spiritual existence. The moment Lady Odalina's breath left her body, the servants sprang into action, following elaborate protocols designed to protect both the deceased and the living from various supernatural dangers. They ran furiously through the castle, emptying every vessel of water, because they believed the departing soul might be drowned if it encountered standing water during its journey to the afterlife. This practice reveals the medieval understanding of death as a gradual process rather than an instantaneous event. The soul didn't simply vanish at the moment of biological death. It lingered in the vicinity for some time, potentially vulnerable to various hazards. Standing water was hazardous because it was believed that souls were drawn to reflective surfaces, where they might become trapped or confused about their proper destination. The dead body itself required constant vigilance until it was buried. Guards observed to prevent the devil from replacing Lady Odalina's corpse with a black cat, and to ensure that no dog or cat ran over the coffin, which could transform the corpse into a vampire. These weren't just superstitions. They were practical precautions based on widely accepted beliefs about the supernatural dangers surrounding death. Baron Conan and Adela didn't necessarily believe in all these notions, but they didn't dispute them with their servants. This was typical of the medieval aristocracy's approach to folk beliefs, skeptical tolerance combined with practical accommodation. Whether or not the nobles believed that black cats could replace dead bodies, they understood that their servants did believe it, and maintaining household harmony required respecting these concerns. The elaborate precautions surrounding Lady Odalina's death also reflected the medieval understanding that death was a spiritually dangerous time for everyone involved. The boundary between life and death was seen as permeable and unstable, creating opportunities for demonic interference and supernatural confusion. Proper ritual protocols were essential for ensuring that the deceased reached their proper destination and that the living remained protected from otherworldly threats. The elaborate choreography of medieval death. And so, we arrive at the final performance of medieval life, the elaborate rituals surrounding death and burial that transform biological termination into spiritual theater. The death of Lady Odalina offers a detailed example of how the medieval upper classes approached the end of life, transforming what might have been a simple biological event into a complex ceremonial production involving multiple participants, expensive materials, and carefully orchestrated symbolic gestures. The first step after Lady Odalina's death was careful embalming, a process that served both practical and spiritual purposes. The body needed to be preserved long enough for elaborate funeral preparations, but embalming also demonstrated the family's wealth and social status. Only the wealthy could afford the expensive spices and professional expertise required for proper preservation of the dead. The removal of Lady Odalina's heart for separate burial at a nunnery she had patronized reflects the medieval practice of dividing the body to maximize spiritual benefits. Her heart would rest in a sacred location where nuns would pray for her soul in perpetuity, while her body would lie in the family tomb where her descendants could honor her memory. This division of the corpse was both practical. It allowed the family to maintain connections with multiple religious institutions, and symbolic, representing the medieval belief that different parts of the body had different spiritual significance. The creation of a wax death mask served multiple purposes beyond simply preserving the deceased's appearance. These masks were used in funeral processions to maintain the illusion that the dead person was still present and participating in the ceremonies. They also served as models for more permanent memorial sculptures and as objects for private devotion by grieving family members. The laying out of the body on a handsome bed with black hangings transformed the death chamber into a temporary shrine. The black fabric wasn't just a symbol of mourning, it was expensive imported material that demonstrated the family's wealth and their commitment to honoring the deceased appropriately. The choice of bed, rather than a simple bier, emphasized Lady Odalina's continued status as a member of the household, even after death. The temporary altar set up in the death chamber allowed for continuous masses to be said for the deceased's soul, without requiring the body to be moved to the church immediately. This was particularly important because medieval theology taught that the period immediately after death was crucial for determining the soul's fate. The more masses said during this period, the better the deceased's chances of avoiding or shortening their time in purgatory. The armed guards who maintained vigil over the body served both practical and symbolic functions. Practically, they prevented the theft of valuable grave goods and protected against the supernatural dangers believed to threaten unguarded corpses. Symbolically, they demonstrated that Lady Odalina retained her social status even in death and deserved the same protection and honor she had received during her lifetime. The burning of 2 or 3 scores of tall candles around the bed created an impressive visual display while serving critical spiritual functions. The light was believed to guide the deceased's soul toward heaven while protecting against demonic interference. The expense of maintaining so many candles for the entire period before burial also demonstrated the family's commitment to providing their deceased relative with appropriate honors. The actual interment took place in the Abbey Church, in the transept where many generations of the St. Aliqui family had been buried. This location was carefully chosen to reflect the family's long-standing relationship with the religious community and their permanent place in the social hierarchy. Being buried inside the church, rather than in the external cemetery, was a privilege reserved for the wealthy and powerful. The placement of a silver cross engraved with words of absolution on Lady Odalina's breast served as both a symbol of her Christian faith and a kind of spiritual passport for the afterlife. The silver demonstrated the family's wealth, while the words of absolution provided written proof of her forgiveness that could presumably be presented to divine authorities if needed. The 4 small earthen pots, containing incense from the funeral ceremony, were buried with the body to provide continued spiritual protection in the grave. This practice reflects the medieval belief that sacred substances retained their power even after the ceremonies that had blessed them were complete. The incense would continue to purify the gravesite and protect the deceased from demonic interference indefinitely. The commission of a life-size marble effigy to rest upon the tomb represented the final transformation of biological death into a permanent memorial. This sculpture would serve multiple purposes. It would preserve Lady Odalina's appearance for future generations, demonstrate the family's wealth and artistic sophistication, provide a focal point for ongoing prayers and remembrance, and secure a permanent place in the church's visual landscape. Our source notes that this effigy expressed how truly noble had been his gracious mother through the dignity and genuine peace of form and face. This wasn't just artistic skill, it was a form of ideological messaging. The sculpture presented an idealized version of Lady Odalina, emphasizing her spiritual and social virtues, while eliminating any traces of the physical suffering and decay associated with illness and death. The contrast between noble and common funeral practices reveals the extent to which death, like life, was organized according to strict social hierarchies. While Lady Odalina received marble caskets and elaborate effigies, common folk had to make do with much simpler arrangements. Even poor peasants, however, received decidedly elaborate funerals by modern standards, suggesting that medieval society invested heavily in death rituals across all social classes. When a person of even modest consequence died in the village, a crier would walk through all the lanes, ringing a bell and calling out the deceased's name while adding, "Pray God for the dead." This public announcement served both practical and spiritual purposes. It informed the community of the death and solicited prayers that would benefit the deceased's soul in purgatory. Peasants of quality were typically buried in plaster coffins, which were expensive enough to represent a significant financial sacrifice for rural families, but cheap enough to be accessible to anyone with modest prosperity. The poorest class of peasants was wrapped only in rags and buried in shallow pits, but even this minimal treatment represented community acknowledgement of their human dignity and spiritual worth. The worst fate was reserved for those who died excommunicated by the church or who had committed suicide. These unfortunates could not be buried in consecrated ground, which meant their souls would be cut off from the spiritual benefits that flowed from proximity to sacred space. Their bodies were often left exposed to be torn by dogs and crows, making their spiritual exile visible and permanent. Sometimes a hardened sinner might repent sufficiently on his deathbed to be restored to the graces of religion, but even then, special precautions were required. The body might be burned while loaded with iron or bronze fetters, a practice designed to mortify the flesh even after death, and thereby reduce the fires of purgatory that awaited the departed soul. This practice reveals the medieval understanding of death as the beginning rather than the end of divine judgment. The suffering imposed on the dead body was thought to have direct effects on the spiritual suffering experienced by the soul in the afterlife. Physical mortification of the corpse could serve as a kind of advance payment toward the debt of punishment that every soul owed for its earthly sins. The elaborate attention paid to funeral customs across all social classes reflects the central importance of death in medieval thinking. In a world where life was short, disease was common, and mortality was high, death wasn't a distant possibility, but an ever-present reality. Everyone knew they would probably die young, and everyone needed to be prepared for the complex, spiritual and social challenges that death would bring. The investment in funeral rituals also reflected medieval beliefs about the continuing relationship between the living and the dead. The deceased weren't simply gone. They remained active participants in the spiritual economy, their souls working toward salvation in purgatory. In contrast, their earthly remains claimed ongoing honor and attention from their survivors. Death was a transition rather than a termination, requiring careful management to ensure the best possible outcome for all concerned. These elaborate death rituals served critical social functions beyond their spiritual purposes. They provided opportunities for communities to reaffirm their values, demonstrate their solidarity, and negotiate questions of status and hierarchy. A funeral was a public performance that allowed everyone involved to display their relationships with the deceased while positioning themselves within the larger social order. The enormous expense associated with proper funeral arrangements also served economic functions, redistributing wealth from bereaved families to artisans, clergy, and service providers throughout the community. A major noble funeral, such as Lady Odalina's, would employ sculptors, embalmers, candle makers, textile workers, musicians, and countless others, creating economic ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate participants. The lasting monuments created by funeral expenditures, the sculptures, the elaborate tombs, the endowed masses, served as permanent advertisements for family status and spiritual commitment. Future generations would see these monuments and remember not just the deceased individuals, but the wealth, piety, and social connections of their families. Death became a form of competitive display that extended family rivalry into the afterlife. Ultimately, medieval funeral customs reveal a society that took death seriously, viewing it as both a spiritual crisis and a social opportunity. The elaborate rituals surrounding the end of life reflected deep anxieties about salvation and judgment. Still, they also provided structured ways for communities to process grief, affirm values, and maintain social cohesion in the face of inevitable loss. The contrast between the elaborate preparations for Lady Odalina's funeral and the simple burial of poor peasants wrapped in rags illustrates the fundamental medieval truth that death, like life, was experienced differently according to social class. However, even the poorest received some form of ceremonial recognition, acknowledging their spiritual worth and human dignity. In a world where life was harsh and death was common, the rituals surrounding the end of life provided everyone with some measure of comfort, meaning, and hope for what lay beyond the grave. And so we conclude our journey through the darker corners of medieval existence, where charity often masked indifference, medicine combined wisdom with folly, and death provided the ultimate test of both spiritual preparedness and social status. These were people who lived with suffering as a constant companion, who faced disease without effective remedies, and who approached death with elaborate rituals designed to ensure safe passage to whatever lay beyond. Their world was harsh, their lives were short, and their medical knowledge was painfully limited. However, they created systems of meaning and community that helped them endure whatever fate and biology dealt them. In the end, perhaps that's the most we can ask of any civilization, not that it eliminates suffering, but that it provide frameworks for understanding and enduring the suffering that inevitably comes to all human lives. Monastic hospitals, quiet places of piety and limited effectiveness. In our modern imagination, hospitals are institutions of healing. In the medieval world, this assumption did not quite hold. The medieval hospital, especially those attached to monasteries, were less about curing disease and more about providing Christian charity. In this place, the sick could die with their souls in order. Picture a long, narrow hall, built of stone and timber, with high windows that let in little light. Beds line the walls, most without mattresses, just straw-filled sacks covered by linen or wool. At the foot of each bed, a simple cross. In some, a small shelf with a wooden bowl, a crust of bread, and perhaps a single candle. The beds were close enough that the groans of one patient would be heard by all the others, ensuring that privacy was non-existent and sleep was a collective event. These monastic hospitals did not specialize in diagnosis, and they certainly did not conduct surgical procedures beyond simple lancing or poulticing. Their primary purpose was to provide rest, food, and a religious atmosphere. Three elements believed to be more important for the soul than the body. The monks or nuns who tended these places were motivated by religious obligation, not medical training. Most of the care consisted of administering herbal infusions, applying compresses, or whispering prayers. Lavage or wound cleaning might be attempted, but sterilization was unheard of. Infection was understood in terms of humors, and sin, not bacteria. Death was frequent, quiet, and expected. Despite their inefficiency, hospitals were prized by both the poor and the wealthy. For the poor, they offered a last resort, a place to rest when work was no longer possible. For the rich, endowing a hospital was a shortcut to divine favor, akin to a spiritual investment portfolio. It looked good on your record at the Last Judgment. Dying in a religious house, last rites and last rites. Dying in a monastic hospital was considered a good death, if not a comfortable one. The presence of holy relics and prayers was considered more important than the provision of pain relief. Most patients, if they could speak, were prompted to confess their sins before receiving extreme unction. This was less a matter of personal privacy and more of ritual protocol. Dying without confession risked eternal consequences. A monk, often wearing a robe frayed from decades of use, would lean close and murmur the appropriate rites in Latin. The patient, even if they didn't understand a word, was expected to nod or squeeze a hand in response. The logic was clear. Consent to salvation was required. Even unconscious patients were considered redeemable, so long as the priest believed the soul was still hanging about in the vicinity. Once the rite was given, the patient was not expected to recover. If they did, it caused mild confusion. Charitable obligations in wills, deathbed generosity. As medieval people neared death, they became more generous. This wasn't due to a sudden softening of character, but due to theological necessity. A will was not simply a legal document, but a final accounting of spiritual debt. If you had failed to perform adequate charity in life, your will was your last chance to balance the books. It was common to leave bequests to poorhouses, hospitals, leper colonies, and parish churches. Some wealthy nobles specified the number of paupers to be fed at their funerals, sometimes hundreds. These meals were not extravagant, but they typically consisted of bread, ale, and stew, served in basic wooden or earthenware bowls. The recipients were required to pray for the deceased soul in return. A transaction, once again. Landowners sometimes willed the use of a pasture or woodland to local poor families, but only for a limited time, such as 7 years after death. This ensured that the land would eventually return to the family, while still securing a temporary spiritual benefit. These wills were recorded by clerics, read aloud by scribes, and occasionally contested by angry relatives who found their inheritances diminished by overly generous alms. Legal battles over whether a dying man had truly intended to donate a vineyard to a nearby abbey were not uncommon. The role of weather in death and disease. The medieval belief in humors and miasma meant that weather and seasons were closely watched for signs of impending illness. A hot summer? Expect fevers. A wet spring? Prepare for fluxes and agues. Long winters produce chilblains, frostbite, and a general spiritual heaviness that monastics would call acedia, a spiritual lassitude which we might interpret today as seasonal depression. Farmers noted that plagues often followed mild winters when the rat population grew unchecked. Townsfolk observed that foggy evenings seemed to trap death in the air. Wind was considered both a cleanser and a killer, depending on its origin and intensity. Weather was not an idle topic of conversation. It was a daily diagnostic tool, a forecaster of divine or pestilential intention. Bookkeeping the dead, mortuary rolls, and parish ledgers. The recording of deaths was both a religious and administrative act. Monasteries kept mortuary rolls, often sent in circuits around neighboring religious houses. When a monk died, his name was added to a long scroll, which was then passed from abbey to abbey, each adding prayers and names in return. Parish churches maintained ledgers that included names of the recently dead, especially those who had paid for masses. These lists were recited at certain times of year, most notably on All Souls' Day. Being left off this list was worse than dying. It meant no one was praying for you. Some towns employed a death crier, a man who wandered the streets with a bell announcing who had died, when the funeral would be held, and what prayers should be said. These public declarations were more about logistics than grief. Plague pits, quiet mass graves. During large outbreaks, notably the Black Death, traditional burials became impossible. Enter the plague pit, vast holes dug beyond the town walls, filled with layers of corpses and lime. These pits were rarely marked, and even more seldom consecrated in a traditional manner. Grave diggers worked around the clock, often wearing clothes soaked in vinegar over their faces, the closest thing they had to a protective mask. The work was not ceremonial. Corpses were tossed in, not arranged. The lime was poured to reduce the smell and hasten decomposition. No prayers were spoken beyond the occasional muttered, "God help us." When these pits were later rediscovered, the arrangement of bones told the story. Hurried, panicked, overworked hands doing a job that could never keep pace with death. Caretakers and almoners, dull, repetitive charity. The almoner was responsible for giving out food, coins, or clothing to the poor, often in the morning outside castle gates. His job required little imagination but infinite patience. He had to manage a queue of beggars, determine who was genuinely ill and who was acting, and maintain peace when supplies ran out. Typical duties included preparing porridge in large cauldrons before dawn, distributing crusts of stale bread collected from yesterday's tables, organizing the laundering of rags to be redistributed, recording names of the regulars, or at least trying to, ensuring that no one received alms twice in one day. The almoner worked with the cook and cellarer. When a pig died and couldn't be eaten by the household, it was sometimes salted and distributed to the poor. When candles were half burnt during a vigil, the stubs were gathered and given to mendicant friars or sick tenants. Waste was repurposed. Nothing was thrown away, unless it was dangerous. What the poor wore when dying. Unlike noble funerals, which included shrouds, embroidered robes, and even armor for display, the poor died in whatever they had been wearing when they collapsed. For many, this meant a single, dirt-colored tunic, patched with linen, rough wool, or sackcloth. Shoes were rare. Underclothing was rarer still. If a poor person died in a church, their clothes were sometimes removed by the sacristan and kept as payment for burial. The body was then wrapped in a sheet or rolled into a blanket, especially if the deceased had been a known beggar. There was no coffin, only a stretcher or a door removed from its hinges. Candles and the economics of death. Candles played a central role in death rituals. They represented divine light and were thought to guide souls toward heaven, but they also represented money. Beeswax candles were expensive, reserved for nobles and churches. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were cheaper and smelled awful. Poorer families might only be able to afford a single candle for a wake, placed at the head of the bed and left to gutter until it extinguished itself. In some parishes, candle guilds existed, informal associations where members contributed wax or coin in life to guarantee a complete ring of candles around their body in death. These groups were like medieval burial insurance, with all the solemnity and bureaucracy but none of the payout. Unclaimed bodies and anonymous graves. Occasionally, a person died alone, unidentified, or too impoverished to be properly buried. In such cases, their body might lie in the churchyard for hours or days, covered with a cloak or a bit of canvas. Eventually, the parish would authorize a basic burial, often without a priest, without a marker, and with a recorded name. In urban centers, these bodies were buried in standard plots. In rural parishes, a shallow grave was often dug near the cemetery's edge, sometimes without consecration. If the weather was bad, the burial might be postponed. If multiple bodies accumulated, they might be buried together. Rural versus urban death, a study in stillness. In cities, death was often hurried, public, and logistical. The sick were moved to hospitals or plague houses. Priests rushed from one home to another. The smell of death lingered in alleys and gutters. Bells rang hourly. In rural areas, death was quieter. It happened slowly, with long gaps between symptoms and burial. Villagers might hold a wake lasting several days, sitting with the body and murmuring prayers, gossip, and laments. Children were kept back. Animals sniffed curiously at the door. Bread was baked in silence. The cemetery was often next to the church, bordered by a low wall and populated by wooden crosses that rotted within a few years. Only the wealthy could afford stone markers. Most graves were reused after a few decades, the bones collected and placed in ossuaries. The parish gravedigger, digging, waiting, and digging again. In any medieval village or town, the role of gravedigger was a permanent one, though not particularly glamorous. The gravedigger did not wear a uniform, nor did he receive honors for his labor. He was expected to be there whenever death occurred, and to dig. Most gravediggers worked part-time. They might also be sextons, beadles, or general caretakers of the churchyard. Their tools were basic: a shovel, a pick, a barrow, and a canvas cloth. The shovel was the most important. It required a straight shaft and a narrow blade to cut through compacted clay and loamy soil. The blade dulled quickly in winter. A good gravedigger could open a fresh grave in under 3 hours, assuming the ground wasn't frozen. In colder climates, burial often had to wait for spring. In such cases, the body was stored in a crypt or shallow charnel pit, covered with straw and lime. The delay was accepted without question. The living waited for the weather. Each grave had standard dimensions, 4 feet deep, 7 feet long, and 2 feet wide. This left enough room for a wrapped body, a coffin, if there was one, and some shifting as the soil settled. Grave reuse was common. After a decade or two, older remains were quietly moved to make room. Bones were placed in ossuaries, dry stone shelters for long-dead parishioners. No ceremony marked the transition. The gravedigger's daily rhythm was slow. Mornings were spent checking the yard, trimming weeds, and filling in sunken plots. Midday, he might eat a crust of bread beneath the lich gate. In the afternoon, if someone had died, he began to dig. Sometimes a helper came, especially if the death was that of a noble, but most often, the gravedigger worked alone. Payment was not generous, a penny per grave, maybe 2 if the deceased had left instructions. There were no tips. Parish beadles and the administration of the dead. If the gravedigger handled the physical work, the beadle dealt with the paperwork, although paperwork is generous. Most records were kept on vellum, and many clerks were barely literate. Still, the beadle was expected to keep track of the situation. He noted names, dates, family relations, and the manner of death if known. If a donor had left a coin to the church, it was recorded. If the death was suspicious, it was marked with a discreet cross in the margin. Beadles also organized funeral processions, announced deaths, and ensured that mourners walked in the proper order. They might carry a staff tipped with brass and wear a faded tabard, depending on the parish. Some beadles rang a handbell and shouted announcements at crossroads. John Smith is gone to God. Pray for his soul. They did not mourn, but they were present, always. Confraternities of burial, brotherhoods of the long dead. In many towns, religious confraternities managed the burial of the poor. These were voluntary groups, part spiritual, part civic, part social, tasked with ensuring that even the most impoverished received a Christian burial. Members wore robes, black for death, sometimes brown. Hoods were common. Their work was structured. They collected alms, bought shrouds in bulk, provided coffins when possible, paid for priests to say masses. They also attended funerals. This was important. A burial without witnesses was unacceptable. The soul needed acknowledgement. The brotherhood guaranteed that someone would watch the body go into the ground, that someone would murmur a prayer, that someone would care, even impersonally. These groups often kept ledgers of the deceased, poor children, pauper women, old beggars, the infirm. Each name was written carefully, even when little else was known. Some entries read, "Widow, no known name, died by road." The record was enough. The last meal, deathbed diets and digestive concerns. What did one eat before death? It depended on timing. If death came suddenly, there was no last meal. If it came slowly, as most deaths did, then there were meals, reduced over days to liquid, then nothing. Pottage was common, a thin stew of barley, onions, and leeks. Milk, if available. Wine for the rich, weak ale for everyone else. Meat was rare near death. not because of ethics, but because the stomach failed. Bread soaked in broth, sometimes flavored with garlic. If a priest came, he might bring communion. This would be the final act of nourishment. The sick did not always want food. Dying was a hungry business at first, but then it wasn't. As breath shortened, as the pulse slowed, appetite became ceremonial. Wives or daughters spooned broth into cracked lips. The dying sipped, or refused. Then they slept. Animals at the edge of death. Animals played roles in medieval death, not always symbolically. Dogs howled at death, people believed. Some claimed they could smell a dying person hours before the last breath. Cats were viewed with suspicion. If one leapt over a corpse, it might become a revenant. Precautions were taken. Cats were locked up. Dogs were kept tied. Oxen drew the carts that carried bodies from town to churchyard. They strolled, hooves clicking on cobblestones. Black clothes sometimes draped the cart, more often not. Ravens circled overhead, always watching. They were not feared, just noted, part of the process. Preaching death, sermons of sickness. Clergy were required to preach about death on a regular basis. These were not comforting messages. The typical sermon began with a memento mori. Remember, O man, that thou art dust. This was followed by examples: how quickly kings died, how soon youth faded, how often sickness came in the night. Preachers emphasized bodily corruption. They described the decay of the flesh in detail. The tongue swells, the eyes sink, the belly bloats. It was meant to encourage repentance. It also terrified the laity. Sickness was explained as punishment, not always for personal sin, but for sin in general. A sick child might suffer because the village had failed to tithe properly. An old woman might cough up blood because the baker lied about his grain measures. The solution was prayer, confession, and donation, especially donation. Mourning practices, tears, rags, and silence. Grief was structured. Mourning garments were required. Black if one could afford dye, brown or gray otherwise. Widows covered their heads for weeks, sometimes months. Men shaved their beards, depending on the region. Children were expected to cry, but not loudly. Weeping was both genuine and theatrical. Some hired mourners to cry at funerals, not to deceive but to enhance the occasion. Loud grief was thought to help the soul rise more quickly, although this was debated. Some families remained silent for days. Others sang psalms. It depended on region, custom, and mood. At noble funerals, tapestries were hung over the walls of the great hall. Everyone wore gloves. The food was minimal. No music. Death omens and quiet superstitions. Many believed death sent signals. A bird is tapping on the window, a candle that wouldn't stay lit, a dream of a relative who has already passed away. Bells were heard when no bell rang, a loaf that cracked in the oven, a child who stopped speaking. These signs were taken seriously. Shoes were placed upside down beneath beds to confuse evil spirits. Mirrors were covered with cloth. The body's mouth was closed with coins. Salt was sprinkled near thresholds. The house was quiet. Even laughter was muffled. It was said that the dying soul hated noise. Purgatory and the economics of the afterlife. Once dead, the real work began. Souls passed into purgatory, a place of cleansing fire, temporary but intense. How long one stayed there depended on sins, prayers, and donations. Masses could reduce time, So could good works. So could the intercession of saints. But money helped most of all. Families paid for trentals, 30 consecutive masses. They bought candles to burn for 40 days. They gave alms in the name of the deceased. More affluent families built chapels. Poorer ones scraped together coins for a single parish mass. This system was not seen as corrupt. It was efficient. The soul benefited. The priest benefited. The poor benefited, if they were the chosen recipients of posthumous charity. It was a spiritual economy. Charity, after the plague, too many dead, not enough bread. When death came in waves, plague, famine, war, charity systems broke. Bread lines grew longer, almshouses filled, graveyards overflowed. Monasteries limited their distributions. 1 loaf per person, not 2. No more ale, only water. Clothing was rationed. Only those with parish records could claim aid. This caused tension. The deserving poor accused the undeserving of fraud. Clergy preached sermons on gratitude, urging patience. In towns, authorities issued badges, small tokens to identify those eligible for alms. A wooden disc, a bit of linen tied to the sleeve. These were counterfeited. Some beggars died waiting. The bone picker and the charnel house. When cemeteries filled, older graves were emptied. The task fell to the bone picker. He worked slowly, dug down to the remains and collected bones in sacks, sorted skulls from femurs and stacked them in charnel houses, stone rooms with niches and shelves. No prayers were said. The bones had already been prayed over. These charnel houses were quiet, dry, and visited rarely. Only monks or gravediggers entered. They smelled of dust and limestone. Sometimes a skull would roll loose and not be replaced. The bone picker was not feared. He was necessary. The slow burial of the unknown. Not every corpse had a name. Travelers died on the roads. Paupers died in ditches. Soldiers died far from home. Their bodies were buried quickly. A shallow trench, a cross made of sticks. Sometimes nothing. These graves were not marked on maps, but locals remembered. He was buried there, they'd say, gesturing to a bend in the path. Eventually, the memory faded. The wind erased the mound. Grass returned. But for a time, it mattered. Saints of the sick and dying, a full index of specialties. Medieval Christians maintained a detailed index of saintly intervention. Saint Sebastian for the plague, Saint Apollonia for a toothache, Saint Vitus for seizures, Saint Dymphna for madness, Saint Roch for skin lesions, Saint Jude for hopeless cases, Saint Barbara for sudden death. Prayers were formulaic, often copied from manuals. Some illiterate patients clutched medallions. These saints were not optional. They were essential tools in the arsenal against death. Relics of these saints, bones, cloth, sometimes dust, were kept in glass cases. Pilgrims traveled long distances to touch them. Hopes were high. Successes were rare. Corpse roads and funeral paths. In some regions, dedicated paths led from the village to the cemetery. These were called corpse roads. Bodies were carried along them by designated bearers. No shortcuts were allowed. The path had to be followed in full, or the soul might lose its way. These routes avoided inhabited areas. They curved oddly, always eastward. Stones marked the path. Some still exist, worn smooth by centuries of feet and wheels. No one built houses on corpse roads. It was considered unwise. Children's deaths, small graves, deep sorrows. Children died often. Mothers wept quietly. Fathers dug the graves. The body was wrapped in linen, sometimes the christening gown, sometimes a piece of the mother's dress. No marker, just memory. The funeral was short. A bell rang once. Some parents gave alms in the child's name. Others planted herbs near the grave. Rosemary for remembrance, rue for sorrow. Grief was assumed and not spoken. Summary: the mundane machinery of death. Medieval charity, sickness, and death were not dramatic. They were routine. Systems existed. Roles were filled. Graves were dug. Candles burned. Bones stacked. Each participant, from gravedigger to priest to beggar, played a part. Not always willingly, not always well, but predictably. The suffering was immense. The understanding was minimal. However, meaning was created through habit, ritual, and the slow, repetitive nature of daily